The Alan B. Larkin Symposium on the American Presidency is among the country's premier symposium. Honoring the late Mr. Larkin by keeping his passion for history alive, the symposium features best-selling authors and distinguished speakers and funds biannual conference that brings some of the most accomplished scholars of the American presidency to FAU. Established in 2005, the Alan B. Larkin Symposium on the American Presidency is among the country's premier symposium.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for the rain. I'm John Kelly, the president of Florida Atlantic University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Florida Atlantic University and the 2017 Alan and Charna Larkin Symposium on the American Presidency. And I'd like to start by thanking Ms. Charna Larkin and her whole family for their great generosity in establishing this lecture. Please stand, Charna. Alan was truly a remarkable man who understood how important it is for us as citizens of the greatest democracy on earth to understand the real-world dynamics that drive our branches of government, especially the presidency. FAU is honored to move that mission forward by hosting distinguished speakers with that special knowledge of the subject. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from America's foremost presidential historian, Michael Beschloss. Michael will be introduced in a few minutes by Dr. Stephen Engel, who's a professor of history at FAU and the director of the Alan B. and Charna Larkin Symposium on the Presidency. Dr. Engel is an expert in his own right, ranking among the nation's leading authorities on 19th century America, focusing on the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. His most recent book, Gathering to Save a Nation, was recently published. He is a past Fulbright scholar, is currently a distinguished lecturer in the Organization of American Historians, and is a lecturer for the Smithsonian Institution's Associates Program. He was named Florida Atlantic University's 2016 Distinguished Teacher of the Year. That is elected by all the students of Florida Atlantic University, and was most recently named an Andrew Mellon Fellow. He's made many contributions to our history department, which he chaired for 5 years, and he's done an extraordinary job organizing the symposiums. He's also on my strategic planning advisory committee to make sure I stay on task. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Engel.
Wow, that was a wonderful introduction, President Kelly. Thank you so much. On behalf of my colleagues and all the staff who have helped bring this symposium about, I'm absolutely delighted you're here. Despite the weather, we'll soldier on. Before I introduce today's guests, I wanted to let you know that following our symposium, there will be a book signing out in the lobby, and if you have not yet purchased a copy, copies will be available for purchase. I also wanted to let you know that today's questions have come from students in our classes here at Florida Atlantic University, as well as from high schoolers from Cooper City High School and Oxbridge Academy who are in the audience today with their teachers. I apologize in advance for not taking questions from the audience, but I'm confident we'll cover much of what you wanted to ask. So let me take this opportunity to thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see so many students here, especially the high school students and the teachers. Ask any history professor to tell you why he or she chose to become a historian, and you're sure to hear a story about an inspirational high school history teacher. The Larkin family is the family that I've worked with for several years in this symposium. I never knew Alan B. Larkin, but I've come to know Charna and her wonderful family, and I'm thankful for their generosity in choosing the history department as the vehicle for honoring the memory of their beloved Alan. I'm especially grateful to Charna, who over the years has been an amazing champion of her husband's passion and to whom I am truly indebted. Look around and you'll see why history matters. It's because of Alan Larkin's love and passion for history, and in particular the study of the American presidency, that we are all here today. Born in 1922, Alan was a part of a generation that made a lot of history. They fought a great world war. They suffered through the Cold War, in which Soviets liked to joke to their compatriots, the future is certain. It's the past that's unpredictable. Alan's generation advanced our civil rights. quietly instilled the virtues of self-sacrifice in my generation. Those who are still with us have even learned the vocabulary of their grandchildren. They've learned words like email, Skype, text, tweet, Twitter, iPhone, iPad, iTouch, iTunes, iShuffle. And my personal favorite, the iTunes Pod Shuffle Touch Classic. I'm not sure what that is, but I'm sure Alan Larkin's generation has conquered these new devices in the same way that they fought against the Axis powers in World War II. Another testament to their adaptability. Their motto would be, we will text them on the beaches, we will tweet them on the seas. In less than a decade, the Alan B. Larkin and Charna Larkin Symposium has become a signature program here at FAU, and we're proud to have had a succession of distinguished speakers over the years who have contributed to our knowledge and understanding of the American presidency. Today's speaker is no exception. On the evening of June 30th, 2009, just 5 months into his presidency, Barack Obama made one of his smartest decisions any chief executive could make. He invited a small group of presidential historians to dine with him in the family quarters of the White House. His chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, personally delivered the invitations with a word of caution. The meeting was to remain private and off the record, all of which meant it was sure to make headline news. Michael Beschloss, today's speaker, was among those in attendance. When I told my wife this, she joked, saying, I guess my invitation got lost in the mail. Mr. Beschloss is America's preeminent presidential historian, meaning that he has devoted his career and his life to making the past come alive, and we are more informed because of his labors. Historians spend their lives researching what actually happened in the past, what we are told happened in the past, and then we decide what to believe happened in the past. And when we finally put pen to paper, we attempt to establish some credibility by making you believe that what we are telling you actually happened. In short, historians make history. Indeed, according to David McCullough, who has also graced this stage, you cannot be a full participant in our democracy if you don't know our history. Here at FAU, President Kelly understands that FAU needs historians as much as it needs engineers and biochemists, and we are thankful to him for that. So for the next hour, put aside the knowledge that Michael Beschloss is an award-winning historian, the best-selling author of numerous books, that Newsweek calls him the nation's leading presidential historian, that the Charlotte Observer says Michael Beschloss knows more about America's 44 presidents than perhaps anyone on earth, that the New York Times Book Review calls him easily the most widely recognized presidential historian in the United States, and that Albert Hunt of Bloomberg News calls him a national treasure. Mr. Beschloss serves as the NBC News presidential historian. He is also a regular contributor to the PBS NewsHour. He has served as a historian on the staff of the Smithsonian Institution and has also been a senior associate at Oxford University in England and a senior fellow of the Annenberg Foundation in Washington, D.C. He holds honorary doctorates from Williams College, St. Mary's College in Maryland, Lafayette College. He's a trustee of the White House Historical Association, the National Archives Foundation, and the University of Virginia's Miller Center of Public Affairs. And in 2005, he won an Emmy for his role in creating the Discovery Channel series, Decisions That Shook the World. And I can say here now how thankful we are that he put his Harvard business degree to good use by writing history. The best investment he ever made, no doubt. Surely we have all benefited. Like the works of David McCullough, Michael Beschloss reminds us of Abraham Lincoln's famous words that we cannot escape history and we will be remembered in spite of ourselves. What matters today is not the fame or glory that precedes Michael Beschloss. What matters is his influence, his relevance, and most importantly, his being here today to discuss the critical moments of the American presidency, past, present, and future. I am thankful for his being here. It's like having royalty among us, our own version of Downton Abbey, but without the pretense. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Beschloss to the podium.
That was so nice, Steve. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you all very much. Can you all hear me in the back? I guess if you can't hear me, you can't reply. But wave your arms in the bleachers back? Okay, I think we're good. Thank you very much to President Kelly, and thank you to Steve Engel for that really nice introduction, and especially for mentioning the PBS NewsHour, which not everyone does, and you can clap for that. In fact, there was a guy who once said, I never get this right, but he said that PBS comes in 5 parts. So the 5 parts of PBS are animals talking, English people talking, animals mating, English people mating, and the PBS NewsHour. So I could save, Steve, I could have saved you a little time by just coming out and saying I'm one from category 5, but if I had done that, I wouldn't have gotten to hear Steve say those many too nice things. So thank you again for that really delightful introduction. In fact, it was Jim Lehrer, who we talked, Steve comes from Harper's Ferry, and Jim Lehrer has a house near there. And I didn't mention to Steve, but Jim Lehrer says that he was the one who first began putting historians on TV, for better or worse, and I think that's probably right. And the story he tells is that the first time he did it was PBS was broadcasting, a few of you here might remember the Senate Watergate hearings, 1973. PBS, I think unlike the other networks, at least at the beginning, did them wall to wall. So Lehrer said, here's my big chance, I can put on an historian to talk about the historical context of Watergate. You know, we hadn't tried it before. And he made a wonderful choice. His choice was the great historian Barbara Tuchman. I'm sure many of you have read Guns of August and other great works. And it was a wonderful choice, but what he forgot was that she wrote these great books, but they were also pretty long books, and he had a 4-minute intermission. So as he tells the story, the intermission came, and she was there on air, and he said, Mrs. Tuchman, does Watergate remind you of anything in history? And she said, yes, Jim, to understand Watergate, you have to go back to the 14th century. And she began speaking, and 1 minute passed and 2 minutes, and he says that she was still on her first sentence, it seemed. And then finally, about minute 3, she took a breath of air, and then she said, now, Jim, that brings us to the 15th century. And the result was that Lehrer says he did not put historians on TV for about 20 more years, so I was lucky to beat the statute of limitations. But that's sort of one of the hang-ups of this line of work. I guess also I should probably add to Steve's nice introduction, I got my start in this business in a way. In 1960, I was 4 years old, and I was taken to a Richard Nixon motorcade outside of Chicago. And I barely remember it. My parents told me the story many times later on. I was held up in the air as Nixon's Cadillac came by in this motorcade, and I didn't quite know what I was doing there until later on. I was a historian. I did some research, and it turned out that local Republican leaders, my parents were Republicans, had advertised for parents to bring their young children, preferably 5 or under, to the side of the motorcade and hold them up in the air because campaign of 1960, Nixon kept on giving a speech saying, elect me and your children will not grow up under communism. And they wanted little children held up as examples of the non-communists of the future if Nixon was elected. So that's how I got my start, as a theater prop in a Nixon motorcade. Decide from that what you will. So anyway, I always heard the story, and about 2 years before Nixon died, which was 1992, I got to have lunch with him. I'd never met him before. So I thought at least I would have the chance to tell this nice little story about seeing him when I was 4 in Cook County, Illinois. And so I went there, and Nixon at this point was living in the last house he ever lived in, which was sort of an attached townhouse in New Jersey. And it would not surprise you to know that Nixon was pretty formal the way he structured these lunches. You'd get there, and the first hour, exactly an hour, was in his library at the top of the house. And one problem with my line of work is that, I get to meet a president. The same was true with Barack Obama, as Steve was talking about, I know a lot more about them than they know about me, so my general rule is to sort of keep my mouth shut. But I lost it with Nixon, maybe because I had spent so many years studying him. So I get off the elevator. First thing I saw was a set of golf clubs. So I said, Mr. President, I thought you had given up golf. He said, yes, ever since I had a hole-in-one. And I had to chime in, yes, wasn't that in 1961 with the actor Randolph Scott? And he gave me this weird look, and I said to myself, just shut up, just let the man talk. So I was pretty good during the first hour. But then during lunch, I thought I would tell him about seeing him at the motorcade when I was 4 in Cook County. So I said, Mr. President, you may not remember me, but we have met before. And I told him the story, and he fell dead silent. And then he immediately changed the subject to something like, what do you think of Boris Yeltsin? And I felt as if I'd done something gross in the middle of the table. I didn't know what faux pas I had committed. So when I got home from the lunch, I called up a friend who knew Nixon. I said, if there's any discreet way you can find out what I did wrong, it'd be helpful for me to know in the future so I don't do this to anyone else. So he called me back a couple days later. He said, turns out you struck out 3 times. Number one, you brought up this story about 1960. Nixon is interested in the future, not the past, and so to him that was ancient history. Number two, in case Nixon, through some bizarre lapse, wanted to talk about ancient history, the ancient history he would like to discuss would not be the 1960 campaign, which he lost to John Kennedy. And strike 3, just in case he, through some really strange quirk, wanted to talk about ancient history and the 1960 campaign, the place he really would not like to discuss would be Cook County, Illinois, where he feels that the election was stolen from him by the Kennedy people. So I don't know if there's any lesson in that, except for in all of our occupations, we all should use some personal diplomacy, which I obviously did not that way or that day. But the point of all this is that, the presidential history business, I don't know whether David McCullough said this, we've talked about this, he and I, on some occasions. It's like nothing else because, in all of what all of you do, whether you're students, whether you teach here in the administration or people here from the area, professionally, if you're obsessed with one person for 5 years, it probably means that things are not going well. In my line of work and David McCullough's, it's exactly the opposite, because if you think about it, if we're writing a book on one president, it takes about 5 years. If you're doing it well and you're really engaged with a subject, it means that you are obsessed with understanding who he is and what he does and why that happens. And one thing about that is that David has said this, other historian friends of mine, you run a real risk if you're writing a book on someone for 5 years of becoming a living replica of that person because, you're just thinking all day long about what you've read and come to understand. And so if you were writing about George Washington, as David McCullough has, that would be a good thing. Most of us could use to take on more of George Washington's good qualities or Abraham Lincoln's. 2 of my books were on Lyndon Johnson, which was a slightly more mixed experience than that. When I thought of doing these books, my wife was not entirely certain she wanted to wake up next to a living replica of Lyndon Johnson for the next 5 years for all sorts of reasons. And this was going to be really true because these were books that were based on, some of you may know that LBJ taped a lot of his private conversations, about 700 hours, and these were just released at the time I was going to do these. So these were books that were based on those tapes and with transcripts of them. And so, it's one thing if you're just reading someone's letters, but if you're listening to his voice 14 hours a day, you are really going to turn weird and really become, sort of a living replica of the president that you're thinking about. So before I decided to do this, I thought, I'm not a lawyer, but I would, consult the 2 people who'd be most immediately affected if I turned into a living LBJ. And the first of these was my assistant. So I thought, to do this with due diligence, I'd play for her a tape of LBJ talking to one of his assistants, or actually more to the point, screaming at one of his assistants, and there were about 800 of those to choose from because he was pretty rough on the people who worked for him. And my assistant, she put the headphones on her ears and heard the tape of this screaming voice, and she said, you know, Michael, I'm not sure whether this is the book for you to be writing at this point in your career, at least as long as I am working for you, she said. But the other person who'd be most affected would be my wife. And so I thought I would play for her some tapes of LBJ talking to his wife, Lady Bird, on the telephone. And one of the revelations of these tapes, well, actually one of them was that Lyndon Johnson taped a lot of his telephone calls to his wife without her knowledge, which I would not recommend for any marriage. I mean, she had a sense of humor about it, but the other thing is that often when he called her up, he would talk to her just beautifully. He'd call her up and say, my darling, I long to see you. My wife heard that and said, this is exactly the book you should be writing. You should talk to me much more the way that he talked to her. So with that permission, I went on. But the point I'm making is that for those of us who do this strange thing of writing presidential history, oftentimes, and I think David McCullough would agree with this too, you know, the normal sources tell you a lot, you know, memoirs and national security documents and letters and so on. But oftentimes you find a lot more about who the person is if you can get into things that people did not know at the time he lived. You know, sometimes gives you a little bit of a flash of insight. For instance, if Lyndon Johnson were here, he would count the number of seats. He was very quantitative oriented. When his library opened, he went home to Texas, 1969, built his library, opened his presidential library, spring of 1971, and if you had to choose a month in human history that was probably the worst month to open a museum to Lyndon Johnson, it probably would have been May of 1971, because as many here know, Vietnam War was still going on. People were still very angry at LBJ. There was uproar on the campuses, including maybe this one. I should do some research into that. And so not many people were coming to visit this library and museum. And Johnson knew it was a problem because, you know, he had a lot of experience, 37 years in the federal government. If you don't get people to your library, the feds cut your budget. But Johnson solved the problem in a way that was uniquely his. Anyone actually been to the Johnson Library here? Well, quite a few, so you are presidential history students. You may have noted that there was a pretty large football stadium across the street. University of Texas gets about, I think about 105,000 people to games. So Johnson, and I'm going to clean this up slightly for this elegant audience in this institution of revered higher learning. You start quoting Johnson in private, you have to clean up just about everything. But he called up the guy who makes announcements at halftime and said, anybody who wants to make an announcement on Saturday that anybody who wants to take a leak or get some cool water can do it at the Johnson Library across the street. And the announcement was made. Thousands of people flowed through the front doors of the library. They were duly counted as visitors. And so help me, by the end of 1971, Johnson Presidential Library was the best attended presidential library in the United States. So you're trying to figure out how a president gets things done. Oftentimes it happens in a way that the civics textbooks do not tell you. Let me give you one other Johnson example, and I will move on. An example of this. Those of you who went to the Johnson Library, did you also go to the ranch by any chance? The LBJ Ranch? A few, outside of Austin, which is 72 miles away. And did you happen to see behind the ranch house, there's a little thing, looks like sort of a convertible Studebaker, pale blue. And what this thing is, it's behind the house. Most people don't know it's actually something called the amphicar. Anyone here know what the amphicar was? Would anyone like to volunteer? What was the amphicar?
You could drive it on land or in water.
Yeah, you could drive it on land or in water, but looks like a normal car. And so the question occurs, how did the 36th president use this thing? And I had done my research. The way he used it was this. if you were a new member of Lyndon Johnson's White House staff, he would invite you down to the ranch, and he would say, "Let's go for a drive in my car." You did not know this was an amphibious car. You just thought it was sort of a convertible sports car. And so the president would get into the driver's seat, and you, the new aide, would get into the passenger seat. And Johnson famously would go very fast, and he'd begin this motor journey with a full paper cup of Cutty Sark. And within about 3 minutes, it would be an empty cup. And he would jam on the brakes, and I'm told the Secret Service agents had to hustle so fast to fill up the empty cup that if they didn't do it fast enough, he'd threaten to have them sent to Nome, Alaska, or someplace they didn't want to go. So they were usually pretty quick. And then he'd be going very fast again, and he would charmingly throw his Stetson across the speedometer and to see, so you wouldn't know exactly how fast you were going. And then he would go very fast straight toward either the Pedernales River or Lake Lyndon B. Johnson. Is there anyone here who needs to know who named Lake Lyndon B. Johnson? You could probably guess. So he'd be going straight toward the lake really fast. The car would go in, at which point the president would say, "The brakes are failing, we're all going to die." So the new aide must, have thought this is my new boss some madman? And in a way, he probably was. But to Johnson, what was the serious purpose of this exercise? The purpose was to answer for himself what was the immortal question: when the crunch comes, will my new aide try to save his president, or will he try to save his blank? And so by my count, from most of these stories, anyone here had Washington experience? If you've had much time in Washington, this will not surprise you. As far as I can see, about 90% of the aides tried to save their blanks. So basically you had this scene where the aide would swim off, saving himself, letting the president drown, at which point Johnson would press a button and the gills would inflate and this amphibious car would start moving and everyone was fine. And they would get back to the White House and Johnson would say, "There's old Joe or old Jake, pretends he's loyal to me, but guess whose blank he was trying to save when crisis came." So not the most important thing to know about Johnson, but if you're trying to understand who he was, this is the kind of thing that does help you do that a little bit. And that's the main point I would make about presidential history, and that is that, people will say, how will Donald Trump look in history? Or they will say, how will Barack Obama look in history? And the real honest answer is, you can't say this soon to the time that a sitting president serves in office. I think Steve will agree with me. Steve, are you here somewhere? I don't want, you're, okay. If you disagree, please stand up and yell at me. But if it's really history, it takes at least a few decades to get beyond the time that a president serves. One reason for that is sort of what I've been saying, which is that only if you wait that long will an outsider, which every historian should be, an outsider get access to letters and the frank recollections of the people around a president, national security documents, tapes like the ones I was talking about with LBJ. It takes usually at least a few decades for those things to come out, and they usually give you a different idea of the president from the one that outsiders had at the time that he served. One case I always think of is, I grew up in Illinois, and one of our presidential nominees who was not elected was Adlai Stevenson. Some people might remember, was nominated twice by the Democrats in the 1950s. And when I was a young historian, I met someone who had worked for Stevenson who was wooden as a campaigner, to put it mildly. And like a fool, I said, I was young, I said to this guy, "You must have learned so much about campaigning going around with the great man Stevenson." And he looked at me as if I was crazy. He said, "Well, actually, Stevenson was a terrible campaigner, but obviously we didn't say that while he was living or even for a while after that." And he told me the true story of the day that Stevenson was campaigning in the primary of this state, the Florida primary, 1956. And he was in a shopping center, northern Florida, And even he realized that he was not connecting with these voters. So Stevenson says to his aides, "What am I doing wrong?" An awkward silence ensued because they didn't want to alienate the boss. So finally, one brave guy stepped forward and said, "Governor, here's the problem. You remember this morning you were in that shopping center in northern Florida? Little girl stepped up to you and gave you that stuffed dead baby alligator. What you should have told her, Governor, was, 'Thank you for the alligator, little girl. It'll look perfect on my mantle back in Illinois in my house,' instead of what you did say to her, Governor, which was, 'For Christ's sake, what's this?'" It's the kind of story they didn't tell when Stevenson was still around. So that's one reason why it's a good idea to wait. Maybe a John Kennedy example. President Kennedy, in his first year in office, 1961, went to London and met with the British Prime Minister, whose name was Harold Macmillan. And if you look at, say, the New York Times or another newspaper of the time, it says the two leaders had a private meeting that was on mainly about the Soviet Union, and it sure was. But later on, I was writing a book about Kennedy, and I got access to the notes that were taken by someone who was actually in this private meeting. And turns out that a lot of the private meeting, Kennedy complained about bad press coverage of his wife, Jackie. Press was saying that she spent too much money, she spent too much time in Europe, which he also complained about these things but didn't like to see them in the newspaper. And he was going on for so long on this. Macmillan, who was a generation older and wiser, says, "Jack, just brush it off. It's just the press. It's not going to affect your life." And it made Kennedy even more irritated to hear him say that. And Kennedy said, "How would you like it, Harold, if the British press reported that your wife, Lady Dorothy, was a drunk?" And actually, she did drink too much. And Macmillan said, "If the press reported that my wife drank too much, I would just issue a formal statement saying you should have seen her mother." It's a kind of thing you wouldn't have gotten in real time, but thanks to us historians waiting a couple of decades, that's the kind of thing that you could learn. It adds nuance to their relationship. And maybe one more Johnson example. Johnson, as I mentioned, made all these tapes that I wrote these books on, and they tell you a lot absolutely fascinating, important about Vietnam and civil rights, other problems he was dealing with, but not all the calls were quite that august. In August of 1964, for instance, there's one call that Johnson calls up the head of the Hagar Slacks Company in Dallas, and this one I really have to clean up. He says, "I got a pair of your trousers, bought them in a store. I like them, but the store-bought kind don't quite fit properly." And he goes into extreme anatomical detail, which I cannot repeat, why they don't fit properly. I guess the one sentence I can repeat here is Johnson says, "The store-bought kind, I wear them, it feels as if I'm riding a wire fence." Okay, so Mr. Hagar got the idea, had some custom-made trousers made and sent to Johnson. Everyone was happy. So I figured he said it, I'd put it in the book, which I did. And about a month after that book came out, Lady Bird Johnson was nice enough to have a dinner for me in Austin. And like a total idiot, I said, "Mrs. Johnson, were you happy with the way the book was received?" And she was quite no nonsense. She said, "Well, Michael, I probably could have lived the rest of my days perfectly happily without hearing you play the Hagar Slacks tape on television," she said. "But," she says, "you should know that the Hagar Slacks tape is my grandchildren's favorite. So anyone who can tell me what that was about, please let me know by the end of the afternoon." And actually, the other thing was about a month after that, I got a letter from old Mr. Hagar, who is still alive, offering me a free custom-made pair of Hagar slacks. So who says there are no perk for historians? But the point I'm making is that for Johnson, I can't think of very much that he would have been more horrified by than to have the Hagar Slacks tape played, certainly during his lifetime or ever. This is what presidents spend their lives usually trying to make sure does not come out. But if you're an historian and you wait a few decades, you begin to get the flavor of who these people are, and a lot more important issues than that, too. So that's one thing that's important in presidential history. The other key ingredient, aside from getting information that you couldn't get in real time, is that mysterious element called hindsight. You know, I can tell you what I think Donald Trump might be remembered for, but it's going to be very different from what I or another historian might say 30 or 40 years from now, because that person will benefit from the hindsight of knowing how things turned out. And that is true of every president. If there was a war, how the war turned out, how the world looked later on, whether the economy got better or worse, you know, whether what he did in office really did help the American people in the world. Much more difficult to see in real time than it is decades later. Great case in point, Harry Truman. Harry Truman went back to Missouri, 1953, with a really low Gallup poll public approval rating. Anyone know what it was or want to take a guess? Yes, sir? 12%. Wasn't as low as 12, but it was getting pretty low. Do I hear 20? 20. Do I hear 22? 22 sold. 22% it was. And 22 in those days was like 12 these days. So the burden of what you're thinking is right. And the reason why there's been such sort of, I guess it would be deflation in polls, that 22 in those days would be like 12 nowadays, was that, if you can believe it, in 1953, Americans were shy to tell a pollster that they hated a president. It's not a problem they've had in the last 20 years or so, a lot more frank. So Truman was very unpopular. And when I was a young presidential historian, I was curious about why. And I looked at the internal numbers, and yes, the Korean War had gotten unpopular, and there was petty corruption in his entourage, Truman's, but a lot of people told the pollsters, I don't like Truman because he doesn't remind me of a real president. He doesn't look and sound like Franklin Roosevelt, which was the president that they had remembered for 12 years. And actually, the true story is told that in 1952, Truman was asked, it was during the campaign of Eisenhower and Nixon versus Stevenson and his running mate, and Truman was asked what he thought of Richard Nixon by a reporter. And Truman told the reporter, I think that Nixon is full of manure. And Truman's assistants went to Mrs. Truman, Bess, and said, couldn't you get the boss to speak a little bit more elegantly? And her reply was, you have no idea how long it took for me to get him to use the word manure. That's what she was dealing with. But the point is that in 1953, in almost real time, whether Truman said manure or not seemed really important, whether you were judging him, when you were judging him as president. Now here we are, 60 years later, I would say a lot more important would be probably the most important thing he did from my point of view, which was devising the strategy that allowed America ultimately to prevail and win the Cold War. If we were talking about Truman in 1953, we could say, yes, he did NATO and the Marshall Plan. Greece and Turkey stood up to the Soviets in Europe, but you could not say how the Cold War would turn out. Nowadays, we have total 20/20 hindsight. We know that the Cold War ended. America won. The credit goes in great measure to Harry Truman, who was the one who devised the way to do it. So that's why presidential history, that way of studying presidents, is so different from all of us as citizens who, watch them on TV or read about what they do on the internet, or actually all of us as citizens who vote. And coming from Chicago, I have a special responsibility as a voting citizen, since when I was growing up in Chicago, we were encouraged to vote more than once on election day, so it's something I studied pretty carefully. I want to thank very much the Larkins for doing this, both Alan Larkin and Mrs. Larkin, whom I was so honored to meet, and members of their family. Could we have a hand for them again? We were talking off stage. We knew it would be timely to talk about presidential history this week, and we knew that there'd be a new president, but we didn't know there'd be this much of a time of change. And rather than talk about politics, I'm going to stick to history in my talk, but if Steve wants to raise, some other questions that are a little bit current, that'd be absolutely great. What I thought I would talk about, and do this, fairly quickly to leave some time for us to have a chat on stage, I think with some of the questions from the audience, right? Are 4 quick moments in presidential history that might be a little bit illuminating, that I think were pivotal moments that every president now who serves and in the future should look back as models. Moment number 1, 1795. And that was George Washington. It was his second to last year in office. And Washington was dealing with a problem, which was he was convinced that only about a decade after the Revolution, the British might attack the United States again. He knew that we didn't have the military to resist. So he sent John Jay to London. Jay did a treaty with the British and sent it back here. And when Americans found out about this treaty, they were wildly angry at Washington because it said that we Americans would have to make all sorts of concessions to the Brits to get them not to invade. And Americans were furious at Washington. They sent him letters. Are you some kind of British agent? You should be impeached. John Jay had it even worse. He was burned in effigy all over the place. He had more of a sense of humor about it. Jay said, I can walk the length of the United States at night merely by the light of all my burning effigies, which is probably true. But the fact is that it was Washington's great courage that said, even if I become unpopular, it's important for me to do this treaty to save the country. And he did become so unpopular that he died 2 years after leaving the presidency. Martha Washington felt that George was so despondent over the fact that so many Americans had turned his portrait to the wall that that's what had caused him to die prematurely. But looking back with hindsight, if Washington had not made that decision, there's a very good chance that this country would have ended after about 13 years, and we would be living in a very different country, or perhaps not be here at all. So that's moment number 1. Moment number 2, coming from Illinois, I assume I'm allowed to mention Abraham Lincoln. They wouldn't let me back in the state otherwise. 1864. Lincoln was running for re-election, and he was told that he was going to lose unless he canceled the Emancipation Proclamation, because a lot of Northern voters they had been patient about the Civil War, been much bloodier than anyone had ever expected, but by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln was saying, the war will not be over until the slaves are freed. And a lot of Northern voters were saying, that's going to be too long, and that's not what you asked us to do, therefore cancel it. And it's not what an 8-year-old would really think of Abraham Lincoln doing, even considering something like canceling the Emancipation. In fact, I went to the Lincoln sites in Springfield when I was 8, and the one memory I have was that in Lincoln's house, anyone been to Springfield? Well, more than a few. Well, in Lincoln's house, there's this chair that they show you that Lincoln sat in, read to his children, and I remember asking the guide, when Lincoln's boys misbehaved, did he spank them? I was 8 years old. And the guide, as I remember with a disgusted look, said, no, can you believe he let those brats run wild through this house? And I heard that Lincoln was my man. I began reading about Lincoln and had a lot to do with my getting into this line of work. But the point is that Lincoln finally realized he could not do something so immoral to him as canceling the Emancipation. And instead he said to Northern voters, look at it this way, you may be impatient with it, but when I unveiled the Emancipation Proclamation, 100,000 African Americans came from the South to the North. They're working in our Union war effort. He won the election, and it changed history. Another crucial moment in American history. Moment number 3, I wanted to do one on Harry Truman, but the problem with Truman is that you have to probably choose about 10 moments because Truman's presidency was so tumultuous and he had to make so many decisions that turned out to be important that it's hard to choose just one. The firing of MacArthur, the dropping of the atomic bomb, winding up World War II, integrating the military, Korean War, and some of the others that I mentioned. And the thing about Truman was, and I think this is important for any president since we're in the week of President's Day, you sure want a president who, if he doesn't know a lot about history, wants to learn. Because there is no owner's manual for the White House. I'm not referring to any, you can draw any conclusions that you wish. But I would say that any president who does not read history or learn about it is foregoing a really important way of making decisions, because any president is going to get all sorts of decisions coming at him very fast. He will never have the kind of information that he should have. Oftentimes these decisions have to be made at once. And one of the only guides that you've got is how other presidents have done these things in the past. Harry Truman said, "Not every reader will be a leader," he said, "but every leader has to be a reader," he said. And Truman also said, you can clap for that, I won't disagree. And Truman also said, the only news there ever is the history that you do not know. And the point he was making is that if you understand history enough, it gives you context to make these uncertain decisions with all sorts of facts flying at you. And in Truman's case, this came out of his life experience, because he grew up in Independence, Missouri, had these thick glasses. His parents said, "We're so poor we can't pay to have your glasses replaced, so no sports, you can't break them." So Truman said, as a result, I read history, and he said, I read every book in the Independence Public Library, which I always thought was an exaggeration until I went to Independence. It's a pretty small library, so he probably did read them all. But Truman said the book that affected me more than any other was a book called, and I apologize for the politically incorrect title, it was called Great Men and Famous Women. The idea, women could not hope to be great, only famous. And the subtitle was From Nebuchadnezzar to Sarah Bernhardt. So as you can see, it covered a wide swath of human experience. And Truman loved this book, and he said, when I was making a tough decision as president, I would think back to that and other history books that I had read, probably not back to Sarah Bernhardt or Nebuchadnezzar, but General Jackson and Abraham Lincoln. And he said, there was never a piece of history that exactly conformed to the decision I was trying to make. But number one, it gave me comfort. Number two, oftentimes there were enough parallels that I saw the decision I had to make more clearly. Very important that presidents use the tool of history in the White House. And one more moment to leave some time for Stephen and myself to talk. I could give you 90 moments, so I'm trying to keep this brief. Final moment is 1964, and that is the Civil Rights Act. And I've got two children who are no longer children now. They're 20 and 22, but as they were growing up, when I would write about something, I'd try to sort of share it with them and explain what I was writing about. And I was once writing about the Civil Rights Act, and how controversial it was, and they said, well, what was in this act? Why were people so angry? And I said, well, what the act said was that basically, whoever you are, whatever race or creed or anything else, you can use public places in America. And my kids said, well, why did that make people angry? Thank God they've grown up in a country that is so different they can't understand it, but it shows why historians have to work much harder to make sure that all of our particularly young people understand how bad this was so relatively recently. So anyway, in the spring of 1964, John Kennedy had been assassinated. It fell to Lyndon Johnson to try to get this bill through Congress. And the House was probably okay. The Senate, he was having a very hard time because, there was a Democratic majority, but there were a lot of Southern white Democratic senators who were not supporting this bill, and so Johnson needed Republicans. And one way that things were so different in those days, people would talk across the aisle. There were friendships between parties. One of Johnson's closest friends in Washington was the Republican leader of the Senate, who had served at the time that Johnson had been the Democratic leader of the Senate, who was a guy from my home state of Illinois called Everett Dirksen, if you might remember that name. And Everett Dirksen, I remember watching him on TV when I was about 5 years old. He sounded just like Mr. Ed, the talking horse, and he's on these Johnson tapes. He does sound like Mr. Ed, but Johnson called him up and essentially said in private conversations, he said, Ev, and he knew that Ev was a bottomless well for flattery, I guess unlike the other 99 senators. He said, Ev, I know you've got some doubts about this bill, but you're a statesman. And if you're for it, the Republicans will be for it, it'll pass the Senate. If it passes the Senate, it'll become law. If it becomes law, then 100 years from now, after it's changed America, 100 years from now, the school children of America will know only two names in history, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. And for that and other reasons, Dirksen supported the bill, and it did change history. Not every school child in America or college student knows the name of Everett Dirksen. I'm sure here at FAU, every student knows the name of Everett Dirksen, a lot of other important things in history and other subjects too. But the point is that if you look back at history, they really should, because it was an emblem of a time when presidents could work across the aisle, made compromises with the other party for the public good. It's another area in which I wish in the future that history would repeat itself. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Hope I didn't go on too long.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I sit in the right seat?
Yeah, right here. This is great. Thank you, Michael. That was terrific.
Thanks. I hope I didn't go on too long. You remember I was saying at the beginning, well, thank you, but I was saying at the beginning how historians resemble the people they write about. I've also written about Hubert Humphrey, who was Lyndon Johnson's vice president, was not unknown to Florida. And Humphrey was a great man in many ways, but he always talked too long. He gave speeches that were about 3 hours. And once even Humphrey knew that he was giving a speech that was going too long, so he yells to the crowd, "Anybody here got a watch?" And someone yelled back, "How about a calendar?" So if I was too long, I apologize.
Well, let me start with a question that I've wanted the answer to for a while. When you had the meeting with Barack Obama, what did he want to know?
And by the way, I was one of those who did not talk to reporters about what was said.
What did he want to know, and what insights did you feel he needed?
Yeah, it's interesting. One thing, the way those things were reported, it was reported as if this was like a unique thing in human history. I went to similar ones that Bill Clinton had with historians. I went to similar ones that George W. Bush had with historians. It was not exactly the same thing, but maybe I'll talk about all three.
Sure.
Not too long, but Clinton would have historians and other scholars oftentimes. The one I'm remembering, it was before his first trip to Russia in '94. And he had sort of a big four-sided table in the state dining room and asked everyone to sort of stand up and give a little 3-minute speech. And it was the first time I'd ever done something like that, and my knees were knocking. George W. Bush would have historians more informally in the Oval Office. They'd be sitting on the two sofas, and remember the first one I got to sit those two chairs in front of the fireplace in the Oval Office where a president usually sits with foreign visitors. At the first one, George W. Bush sat in one, and I got to sit in the other, so that was an experience in life I never expected to have. And it was a lot more informal. It was like a conversation. In Barack Obama's case, there is a room called the Family Dining Room, which is on the state floor. Anyone been to the White House? You would have seen it on the tour. It's not the big dining room, but little room next to it. And it's one long table, and he had about 8 historians, basically the same people, plus some staff members. And he convened this group maybe a half a dozen times, usually about once a year. And he didn't sort of do it in terms of, I have to deal with Afghanistan, next week. What would Andrew Jackson tell me? I mean, he's a lot more sophisticated than that. It was more, the question he would oftentimes ask would be, is there anything in what you know about what I'm doing as president that you think has some historical resonance that's interesting? And that was probably a pretty intelligent way of going about it because, you know, especially people who had written about specific presidents, you know, it just goes through your mind if you're watching a current president do things. It reminds you of things that you're familiar with from your own work. And so that's what those conversations were like, and people would tell other stories and they would argue. And so I'm very sensitive in life. You know, I don't feel it should be part of what I do to advise a president. There are people who are great professional presidential advisors, and I don't see that. I don't think that should be part of what I do. But this was more of a general conversation, and in the way that I was talking about how Truman enjoyed history, I think Truman would have enjoyed a conversation like that. But Barack Obama was very good at running the conversation in a way that people quickly became almost unaware that he was president and we were not. So they were pretty relaxed, and it was interesting.
Very few people come into the presidency prepared for what it, you know, involves. Who had the best instincts in terms of someone coming in, whether they had political experience or not, but who had the best decision-making instincts of the presidents you've studied?
Yeah, it's hard to single out one. I think Truman would be, as I was saying earlier, would be a very good example of someone who was decisive. He knew what he did not know. Famously, he had, you know, Roosevelt died suddenly in April of 1945. He had told Truman very little about what Roosevelt was doing. World War II still had yet to be won. And Truman, this is classic Truman. And by the way, he would so love to be here today because he never got a college education. And it just kills you to think of this extremely bright, curious young man who would have loved nothing better than to go to college, but his family was too poor, and they said, Harry, we need you to go out and work our farm, which is what he did do. And it tells so much about Truman's character that when he became president, one of the first things he did was he said, I want to get the community college system a lot more serious in this country because there are too many people who have to make the choice that I did and don't have access to higher education at all. In any case, Truman, because he knew that he was so unschooled about what a president should be doing at the end of World War II, he literally got about a huge amount of the documents that Roosevelt had been dealing with the last couple of months, and Truman took out a green eye shade, stayed up late at night with this gooseneck lamp, looking at these documents, trying to learn how to be president. But what proved to be most important was that Truman, although he didn't have a college education, he had been vice president only for a couple of months, had been in the Senate maybe for a decade, he had an enormous quality of judgment. And that's something that you probably cannot train someone, you can't, you can't find it in other ways. And you know, when we're voting for a president, that is probably the most important ingredient that you could look for.
Yeah. So when most Americans think of the nation's chief executive, they think of a sort of majestic portrait of, you know, who should hold that position. And in that regard, what would be, in your view, the sort of general consensus about the presidency itself? In other words, what are the great characteristics that most Americans would see the president having to have, whether they were good instincts or, you know, what would be the sort of characteristics that they would think would be presidential?
Well, I think to reel off a few, you know, one would be guts of the kind that George Washington practiced and many others. Another would be the ability to persuade Americans to do things that perhaps they didn't think they wanted to do at the beginning. You know, when I was talking about Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln knew that presidents should be courageous, but he didn't just say, well, presidents should just fall on their sword and be martyrs to the fact that they're for higher purposes. He wanted to make sure that presidents were able to explain themselves, and he was a great lawyer and he was a wonderful writer. And he was able to explain, for instance, that controversial decision as well. I mentioned earlier about use of history. I mean, that is tremendously important. And when I was talking about the ability of a president to work with the other party, what I don't mean by that is a president who just caves to get along. You know, I was talking about Johnson and Dirksen, for instance. They disagreed about just about everything. But what they did understand was that James Madison and the founders, the system that they gave us, I think you'd agree with this, a big part of that was they expected members of Congress to compromise. That was an essential part of the system. In 2017, compromise is a dirty word, and if you do it, you will be primaried and you will probably lose your job. It's making it very hard.
Yeah, and a follow-up question too, because that cuts right into today's. I know we live in a world with a divided electorate, and we'd like to think it's been the only time in history we've had that, which is absolutely not the case.
Ridiculous.
And I don't think most people understand the sort of historical, the history of the divided electorate. Could you compare what we're going through now to another period in American history?
Steve is one of the towering experts on the Civil War. We have not rehearsed this. Would you say that in 1859, 1860, we might have been a little more divided than we are today?
I'd say absolutely.
Despite all these pundits saying this is the most divided country in history.
And it's interesting because we've been tremendously divided and the federal system has prevailed. We're a fairly resilient system here. But interestingly enough, do you think most Americans appreciate that we have a history of a divided electorate, or is it just sort of a contemporary awareness now that, wow, we're really divided, as opposed to, well, we've always had these divisions?
I think people tend to live in the moment. I think, everything is always the largest in history, and so why not, divided be one of those things. But the founders did not see conflict as a dirty word. They felt the problem with England was that there was no political conflict because the king decided and no one argued and everything was perfect. They wanted to make sure that we did the opposite because they felt that conflict leads to the best policies, but conflict was one half of the sentence, the other half was compromise, and they felt that one was as essential as the other. What they did not foresee was the elements of our political system that exaggerate the political conflicts that exist, like the way that we raise money, the way that we gerrymander congressional districts, to some extent cable television and social media, a lot of things that make our system seem as if we hate one another much more than we actually do.
Yeah, and I the questions are coming from the students, and I was really impressed by the sort of variety and the vastness, but also the great insights. There are a lot of people at the university and in high school, obviously, who follow the American presidency, and I think it was Helen Thomas, who's also been a Larkin speaker, who said, our democracy can only endure if the people are informed. And today there seems, and I say today, our contemporary society seems to have a credibility factor with what they're being informed by, especially when it comes to the presidency. Is there another time when we were, as informed, underinformed, misinformed, overinformed as we seem to be today?
I think it's hard to the answer is, I think, really no, because we've never had the internet before and the quantity of information that's available. And of everything that's taught here at FAU, and I know that I'm preaching to the converted, and this is not an academic discipline, but it could be, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier. One of the most important things that you teach here is to make sure that students, by the time they leave here, that they can differentiate between information and analysis they encounter on the internet that they can believe and trust, and information and analysis that they should just discard as worthless.
Yeah.
And that's going to be essential not only for them to be great citizens, but also to have careers and happy lives in this society the way that things are going.
We were speaking earlier about, transitions of power in this country happen peacefully, but not without protest. And history informs us that there's been a lot of protest with transitions of power, whether they're, especially from one party.
And that's the way the system works.
Exactly. What would you make of the sort of current climate of protest?
I think it's healthy, and it goes right back in the tradition of most of American history. Again, I hate to keep on citing the founders, what they would think of today, because I think you'll agree, Steve, that one pitfall of historians is you could say, well, if Millard Fillmore were alive, this is what he would think of Elizabeth Warren.
Sure.
Millard Fillmore is not here to defend himself, so he can't say that we're right or wrong. But you go back through history, the times when the system has worked the best has been when there is protest.
Yeah.
And also, by the way, when the protest is considered as legitimate and thoughtful by those in power, not only in Congress, but also the president.
Mm-hmm. So if there were a guideline for becoming the American president, and you could write the first guide, the first, line of what it means to become the president, and you were to guide this incoming president, what bit of advice would you give them? The very first.
Well, in terms of what you were saying, it would be your critic is your friend.
Yeah.
Do not take it personally. And by the way, I'm in history, I'm not in politics, not giving any political analysis at all. And most of them do, by the way, although I think we may be setting a record in the last month in terms of a president taking this personally, I say as a registered independent who is not in politics. But Lyndon Johnson, for instance, to take an example from history, how much I wish that Lyndon Johnson in 1964 and 1965 had listened to the critics who said, you get involved in Vietnam, this will be a quagmire, you will lose 60,000 Americans, and this will hurt this country in all sorts of other ways. There were critics in his entourage and among the American people saying exactly that as early as 1964. Not only did he not listen to them, but he took it personally and he said, these people are my enemies.
Yeah.
It was not great for the country.
Yeah. So obviously we're living in a different age of media. And, most folks would say that, the media is driven by politics and so forth, and there's an agenda and so forth. Has the current political culture become a victim of the sort of social media, or is the political agenda driving the social media in the opposite direction?
I think social media is terrific. More of it. And again, if I might cite the founders again,
sure.
I think they would love the fact that we now have methods to have the kind of communication among Americans and between Americans and their leadership that did not exist in the 18th century. If you would, as I was saying earlier, if you wanted to criticize George Washington, you could send him a letter. It would take a couple of weeks. He might not get it. You might be critical of him in a newspaper, which you would probably get, at least days late. So he didn't have access to the criticism. We now are at the other extreme. A senator, for instance, who casts a controversial vote, as opposed to Washington's time, where you might get a couple of letters a few weeks later, the hounds of hell descend on you within 60 seconds. On Twitter and social media, your pollster will tell you you just gave away your re-election. Your donors will text you saying, forget it, you won't be hearing from me again. So all the penalties are immediate. And so what that means, I think, is for all of us voters, we've got to take it into consideration when we elect someone. Is this someone who can disregard all that to, take the criticism seriously, but not take these, not regard these penalties are so horrible that he or she will never cast a controversial vote or make a controversial decision.
Yeah.
That's all pretty much new.
Yeah. So how will history judge the 2016 election? We're drilling down now, so.
Well, remember I was saying that you need information at hindsight, and I'm going to answer you very honestly.
Yeah.
I'd like to know how much the Russians were involved in this election. We will know more about that in a year. I'd like to know more about, what was in the minds of the two candidates. And again, on Hillary Clinton's side, and again, I'm not saying this with a political lens, but we were talking about this earlier. She never went to Wisconsin. She spent something like, around $1 billion, and the commercial I saw in November was the same commercial I saw in September. It takes a while to understand these campaigns. But the more important thing than information, as I was saying, is hindsight. And by the way, I'm not equating Russians with commercials. I'm just saying as two examples of the kind of thing that you'd want to know. But more important is you really do need hindsight to understand the import of that election. For instance, there may be a couple of people who, when they were very small, remember the election of 1940. No one's admitting that. But 1940 was a time when Franklin Roosevelt was running against Wendell Willkie. At stake was whether we should enter a war against Adolf Hitler. You were talking about whether the country is divided now. The country was far more divided in 1940. But what you lacked in 1940 or 41 was the hindsight to know, number one, that was one of the turning points in history. Because let's say that Wendell Willkie had been elected on an isolationist platform, and he had not been as fast as Roosevelt turned out to be in preparing the nation for war and getting us directly involved in war after Pearl Harbor and leading the country. Literally at stake was the future of the free world. So, it could be said that hinging on the election of 1940 was whether we would all survive and whether there would be a United States and what this world would be like. I can think of scenarios under which people would say the same thing about the election of 2016. I hope that's not true, but the real answer is we do not have the hindsight yet to understand whether that is true or not.
So I take it you haven't been invited to the White House in this new presidency. So let me follow
Nor
up.
as any other historian that I know of.
If you're invited, what do you tell the current president? And I say that in all your knowledge of history, and you want to do a good service for the discipline of history and to the chief executive.
You're asking the question, I'm answering. Anyone happen to read a New York Times article, and again, whether you trust the New York Times or not, and there was a sentence which said, Mr. Trump, comma, who does not read books, comma. Okay. Hope it's not true. And if it is true, as I was saying about history, any president is really forswearing an awfully important source of insight in making decisions. So, again, I hope it's not true, and if it is true, I hope he's got people in his entourage who does get access to advice that, that goes beyond just his own life experience. And maybe I'll finish with this, because, anyone who says, why is history important? And, it's a very honest question. Especially these days, it's very hard to get a job in life. It's hard to compete. We've got a very competitive culture. It's hard to make a living, maybe more so than many times in American history. It's a very honorable thing to say, why should I spend time reading about all these dead people? And the answer I would give is, whatever career you're going into, whatever life you plan to lead, you've got two choices. You can completely ignore history, and your life experience will be limited to what happens to you and the people that you happen to run into in your life, and that's fine. Your other choice is to read history or, look at movies about history, or there are all sorts of sources about history that do not even involve reading books, although it'd be a nice thing if someone did read books. And if you have some access to history, you have access to the life experience of billions of people who have lived, who were part of the human race. And you're going to live a fuller life, and you're going to live a life that is more in 3 dimensions, and you're going to have more wisdom if you can tap into that whole knowledge base than if you ignore it.
Yeah.
So I think for any president to ignore, that human experience, he is giving up a lot. And I would even be willing to bet that by the time that Donald Trump is no longer president, that he will in some way, all right, please don't restrain yourself, clap if you'd like. We're living in a time when people feel intensely, and I don't want to restrain anyone on either side, although I'm restraining myself. But all I'm saying is that even he who proudly says he does not read books, and he has told that to people, by the time he is no longer president, in some way he will find that he has seen the need to gain access to some of the history of this country that went before January 2017 in the decisions he makes. I hope so.
Yeah. Well, this has been a real treat. It's been a great pleasure to have you. And it's been a real treat for me to get to do the Q&A with you. So I really appreciate it, Mark.
And I love being here at FAU. Thank you for all you're doing.
There'll be a book signing out in the lobby. Thank you, Michael. That was terrific.
It was great. Thank you.